Okay, good morning and welcome to AusCERT 2018. Just a quick reminder to check the AusCERT app and rate and provide feedback on the sessions. And I don't think there's an awful lot more we need to actually go through just now, so if everyone can please welcome Macleod, and who's going to tell us exactly in how much trouble we are going to be in.
So, thanks for coming to the conference's most boring session. There's no denying it, this is a boring topic. It is the world's most boringest topic. But like your taxes, it is boring, but important. For many of you, it is mandatory, and there are dire consequences if you get it wrong, which I assume is why you're here. Just as a background, who here has been to the other sessions on privacy and GDPR? There was one on, there was one on GDPR on, I think, Monday, and yesterday I think there was one on the first 72 hours and how to react in a crisis. This afternoon there's also going to be a panel session featuring Troy Hunt and Wayne Tufek and a pile of lawyers, which should be entertaining. So in that session, I expect that we'll be delving into some of the more difficult questions. On the way here, somebody asked me what happens with the right to be forgotten under GDPR and blockchain, which I'm like, oh God, I'm not ready. Bring that to the panel, is my answer. Today, what I'm trying to do is just lay down the ground rules for the mandatory breach notification, and a small comparison with the Australian privacy scheme and GDPR for anyone who's still awake at the end. It depends. If I see too many of you nodding off, we'll be like, let's call it early. Is it lunchtime yet? But let's launch into it. Now, I've spent a couple of decades working for the private sector and doing IT law. So most of my clients have been IT organizations. The Privacy Act has been around for a really long time. It is older than some of the people in this room, probably by quite a large margin. So people should be familiar with the Privacy Act and what it does and what it's aiming to do by now. But the thing that has come up that's new is, of course, notification. I figured at the time that the mandatory breach notification scheme was introduced that it wouldn't be popular. Because, yeah, look, people were happy to put up a privacy policy. I didn't think they'd be so keen to actually disclose if they'd had a security breach. But as we've seen with the scheme being introduced, it is taking off, and I think that we're going to see an increasing number of complaints or notifications come through. So, although I'm sure that you already know all of this, the Privacy Act, 1988, and it's backed up by various state and territory statutes, sets out the basis of Australia's privacy scheme. It deals with personal information. That's information about, or an opinion about an identified individual or an individual who is reasonably identifiable. And it sets out 13 Australian privacy principles. Number one, have a privacy policy. By the way, it should be a privacy policy that you actually use and that actually reflects what you do in practice, not a thing that just sits in a bottom drawer that you say to people that they should refer to. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So it applies to what's called APP 11 in particular is very important here, because it says that an APP entity that holds personal information must take reasonable steps to protect the information from misuse, interference and loss, as well as unauthorized access, modification or disclosure. So the obligation to keep adequate security over the personal information that an organization holds has already been there in the Privacy Act from the beginning. It is a thing. Holds, by the way, is more than directly holding, but it's anything that an organization has under its control, which means that outsourcing to a third party isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. But what's an APP entity? Now, because politics, the Privacy Act applies to entities with a turnover, an annual turnover of 3 million or more. That was introduced in 2001. The $3 million threshold has not changed. Presumably, as inflation increases, and a hot dog costs $2 million, $3 million will eventually become peanuts. So more and more, a larger and larger percentage of organizations may be captured. But that means that, as it stands, really only reasonably large entities are obliged to comply with the Privacy Act. So the thing that's been introduced is notifiable data breaches. Now, if you fail to comply, it is an interference with privacy, and there are sanctions under the Privacy Act. The scheme started on 22nd of February. It applies to APP entities, and the process is triggered by a thing called an eligible data breach. Because we can't just say everybody be reasonable, because everybody's versions of reasonable vary quite wildly. There are a lot of guidelines and things that have been set down by the Privacy Commissioner, and many, many, many pixels have died in the pursuit of greater clarity in this area. If you need to have a look at the guidelines and things, there are copious, copious notes trying to explain or set down some context around what each of these terms might mean. But we'll go through them quickly. So, an eligible data breach is an unauthorized access to or unauthorized disclosure of personal information under the entity's control if a reasonable person would conclude in the circumstances that the access or disclosure would be likely to result in serious harm to any individual to whom the information related, unless an exception applies. So there's a lot to take in there. But first up, the thing that struck me about this is that it's dealing with unauthorized access to or unauthorized disclosure of personal information, not loss, for starters. So keeping in mind that it only applies to APP entities, so only larger corporations, it only applies to personal information, and it only applies to unauthorized access to or disclosure of personal information. It won't cover, for example, loss of commercially valuable data or access to commercially valuable data. Say some intellectual property has been copied or ripped off or something. It doesn't apply under this. It's only personal information because it's the entire aim of it is to protect people against ID theft. So, let's have a look at each of the terms. What is personal information? That's information or an opinion about an identified individual or an individual who is reasonably identifiable. Whether the information or opinion is true or not, and whether or not the information is or opinion is recorded in material form. There have been a couple of cases on this, not a lot, courtesy of Ben Grubb. We do know that, for example, I think it was metadata relating to his mobile phone usage, I think it was, is not personal information because it's information about the telephone usage, not the person. Okay, so then we're looking at serious harm. Again, because we don't want these privacy principles or the legislation to be too prescriptive, it sets out like principles. So it's not defined what is serious harm, but it could include psychological, physical, emotional, economic, and financial harm. Serious harm to reputation, other forms of serious harm that a reasonable person in the entity's position would identify as a possible outcome of the data breach. It embraces identity theft, stalking, embarrassment, or discrimination. And then you have to think about, is the serious harm likely to have occurred? And that depends on the kind of information, the sensitivity of it, what security measures were in place, whether it was encrypted, for example. So yes, technically it may have been accessed in a way, but it was encrypted, so it wouldn't have made any sense to the person who accessed it. The type of person who might have gained access, and so on. It's not an eligible data breach if it was effectively contained before the damage was done. Again, that to me says that there are a lot of incidents which that could be regarded as serious security incidents or security breaches, which would not be an eligible data breach under this Act. So you suspect that you've had an EDB, an eligible data breach. Now what? Now, if you'd gone to Nicole's very excellent workshop, she dealt with this in more detail. But basically, what the legislation obliges you to do is to carry out an assessment if you have reasonable grounds to suspect that they may have been a serious breach. So if you're not sure, then you have to carry out a reasonable and expeditious assessment, if at possible within 30 days, which is not that expeditious to me, but and certainly not as expeditious as is required under the GDPR, but that's what we have in Australia. And if you can't meet that 30-day deadline, you have to demonstrate that reasonable steps were taken and that you lay out, and this is something that you're going to have to record somewhere, to say that reasonable steps were taken, that what the reasons were for the delay, and reasons why you think that the assessment was reasonable and expeditious. And of course, take remedial action if possible. Again, much has been written about all of these things, and there are very, very good guides on the Privacy Commissioner's website. So if your assessment shows that there are reasonable grounds to believe that an eligible data breach has occurred, then you have to give an eligible data breach statement to the Commissioner, which is a simple online form that you can upload. You have to give that statement to the affected individuals. But in some cases, it's not practicable. Because, for example, there may have been a lot of people involved or affected, but the level of personal information that was compromised may have been quite low. For example, just their email address or just their name. That's lower level than their entire health records. So if it's not practicable to notify specific individuals, then you publish a copy of the statement on your website and take reasonable steps to publicize the statement. And just as a side note, if the breach was done not by you, but one of your contractors or your third-party outsourcers or something like that, either you or the third party can make this notification. Generally speaking, I think that if you have outsourced something to someone who's hosting data, or if you are the data hoster, but you don't have any direct relationship with the clients, it's the entity that has the relationship with the clients that should probably take charge of making notifications. Otherwise, you may be, whichever side you're on, you may find that some random makes notifications to your clients about some data breach that has occurred. It's not going to be a good result. So that may be something that you look at in your arrangements where you are outsourcing, data hosting or anything else, support or whatever it happens to be. What has to be in this EDB statement? It needs to set out what you'd expect, the contact and identity and contact details of the entity, a description of the breach, the date on which the entity detected the data breach, the circumstances, who's obtained or likely to have obtained access, and relevant information about the steps taken so far. That's pretty straightforward. You can put, you can lay out the actual data that was, the information that was involved in the breach, or if it's just information of a kind, lay out the description of the kind, and what steps the entity recommends that the individuals take in response to the EDB. Remember that this is a notification which goes to the commissioner and to the individuals affected. So how do you respond to data breaches? The guidelines give 4 key steps. Again, this has been covered in other sessions, but first up, you need to contain the data breach, which I'm preaching to the converted here. At least this is one conference that I've spoken to, at which I don't have to convince the audience that IT security is a thing, and that they have to do something about the thing. So at least I'm preaching to the converted here, which is excellent. So contain the data breach, assess the data breach, gather your information, evaluate the risk, and remediate the risk. Notify the individuals and the commissioner if required. Now, you may choose, of course, to notify them even if it's not mandatory, but if it is mandatory, then it's mandatory. And then have some sort of a way to review the incident, have a post-mortem, identify any preventative measures so it doesn't happen again. I should say, I was having a conversation with one of Nicole Murdoch, who did one of the other sessions last night, and she said a startling opinion that she's heard a few times now is that if you do this EDB notice and give a notice to the commissioner, that it's a get out of jail free card, so you won't get fined if you make the notification. That's not true. I don't see anything that says that if you make this notification, then the most you'll get is a slap over the wrist or they're there. It's not true. Fundamentally, generally speaking, if you've had an eligible data breach, it's likely that you have probably breached one of the APPs, probably APP 11, not having adequate security or whatever it is. Not always, but quite likely. And if you discover that a breach has occurred, making a notification doesn't mean that, therefore, no penalties will apply. There are penalties that apply for not making a notification when you're supposed to have. But just to be clear, if you make a notification, it doesn't mean that you get off scot-free for whatever breach it was, no matter how egregious or how terrible it was. Now, again, as I said, the commissioner has a lot of guidelines, lots and lots and lots of them. Trudging through them was quite a task. And some of the guidelines are, as you might expect, have a data breach response plan. Here again, I think I'm preaching to the converted. I don't think anyone's sitting there going, yeah, nah, I don't need to do anything about it. Yeah, nah, she's right. But take a look at the guidelines, put together your response plan. Again, for this audience, your personnel are quite likely to be up with what is a data breach. I'm assuming your personnel probably know, but it depends on where you're at. How many people here are, say, government? Government? Yep. How many people here are from large organizations where they're not IT security specific organizations? And who's working for IT security companies? A number. Okay. So particularly for organizations where you might be the IT security expert or the technical expert in your organization, but it is not an IT company, the personnel may need extra training as to what is a data breach. They should know what constitutes a data breach, what is personal information, when is this a serious thing, have a strategy for containing, assessing, and managing data breaches, have something that sets out the roles and responsibilities of staff so they know who to contact if they're not sure. Maybe we've got a thing. Who do I talk to? There should be some kind of clear plan. How to document the data breach? Again, a lot of the remediation and putting together the EDB report and things like that hinge on how well you document what happened. So if you are if you have no plan, so somebody says, oh, I think we've got a problem, it sits in somebody else's inbox for 3-4 weeks because it's not my problem, I don't know, is it your responsibility, and then it gets pinged around a bit, and then eventually somebody gets to do something about it. Eventually it gets to someone who thinks, wait, we do have to take action on this. By then, you've lost a huge opportunity to act in a timely manner, to report things, to document things, to figure out a remediation plan and so on. So again, having a data breach response plan is important because whenever something does happen, should it happen, you'll know exactly how to respond. And again, preaching to the converted, but it's for most organizations, it's not a question of if it will happen, but when. When and how bad it's going to look. The strategy for reviewing the weakness in data handling practices and a system for post-breach assessment, again, that's something which you should have as part of your plan. So not only how to train staff to identify a potential problem and then who they report it to, how it's handled, where it goes next, what steps we take, but also post-incident, what do we do to improve our practices for the future. None of this is groundbreaking or startling, it's fairly common sense. So the scheme started on the 22nd of Feb. And again, as I said, I wasn't thinking it was going to be a popular scheme. I thought that people would be, that entities would be more likely to be scrambling to sweep things under the carpet. Wait, that's what they have always done. Sweep things under the carpet and hope that nobody notices, right? And I thought that that was going to continue, but to my surprise, there actually has been some notifications that have already come out. The Privacy Commissioner does quarterly reports. The first report covered January, February, March. Of course, it only started in mid-Feb, so the numbers are patchy, but already we've seen 63 reported. And you can see, it only started in February. There were already 8. That was like the last week of February. So people were gearing up, and as soon as it started, they started reporting, which is encouraging to see. Where are they coming from? I'm glad that the doctors were first, but legal and accounting was second. Which is embarrassing. Let's just gloss over that. Finance is next, and then education and charities. Again, this is all from the Commissioner's report. Keep in mind, Commissioner isn't listing all of these notifications on its website. So it's not as if when you make an EDB notification that it gets published in full on the internet. That's not what's happening. You make your report to the commissioner. You notify the individuals that are involved. I guess the media might get hold of it if there are a lot of people involved. You know, your Twitter, and you suddenly send out an email saying, "Hey, everybody, please change your password because we've had a thing." Obviously, people are going to notice. For a lot of these notifications, the numbers are very, very small. I think there was one that there was just one person involved. It's still a breach. It still had to be notified. There's only one person involved. It's not as if that entity is published on the commissioner's website. As in, these are the bad guys for the month. That's not the way it's working. There you go. So the number of people affected in the breaches, actually there were 20, where only one person was affected. Now, that doesn't mean that it wasn't serious, because the nature of the information that was disclosed and the person to whom it was disclosed, the circumstances may have meant that the serious harm was going to come out as a result. So, for example, if it was a case of, it wouldn't have been the case because this was pre-scheme, but if it's the case of a police file is accessed, giving a domestic violence victim's details to the abuser, so that the abuser now knows where his ex lives, which happened in Queensland. Obviously, that's one where only one person's information is involved, but it has very, very serious consequences for that one person. So it'd still be an EDB. So that's the basics of the breach notification. Again, we haven't gone through all of the APPs and the existing scheme under the Privacy Act, because that would be beyond boring. That would be terrible. But you should already know that because that's been in place for a long time. Are there any questions at this point? Yep.
So the questions about the Act brought in penalties.
Sorry, thank you for your talk, by the way. One of the previous amendments brought in penalties. So of these 63, were penalties applied, or what's the privacy committee? Because that seems to be what's driving. I better report and I better improve security because I don't want to pay the penalties. But I haven't heard in the media any penalties being applied.
There aren't penalties being applied yet for breaches of the mandatory data reporting notifications. I think, although they have not said so, I think that the philosophy has been, if companies are coming forward and reporting these things, we want to encourage them to keep coming forward for now. The Privacy Commissioner took the same attitude when the Privacy Act was first introduced back in 2001, where they're going, okay, we're putting in this new scheme. There are some penalties under the scheme. We're not going to immediately start smashing people. We're going to educate first, and we're going to allow people some grace period to allow companies some grace period to implement everything that they have to implement. So far, no. Of the ones that have been reported in that first quarter, I don't think any penalties were imposed. I'm not aware yet of any instances where they found out that there's been a failure to report, because it's so new. That may come further down the track, like in a year's time, it may come to light that somebody should have reported an incident back in February or March and they didn't, but we don't yet know them because we don't know because they're not reported. But yes, it seems like the Commissioner's trying to encourage people to report. Yeah. Sorry.
After post-incident and after there's potentially been some form of incident
Sorry, can you start
response.
again? I didn't hear it. I didn't hear the first bit.
So after a post-breach and there's been an incident response, if they cannot come up with satisfactory answers to for the actual notification itself, what happens then? So I guess, for instance, if a hospital is breached, but they're not able to identify exactly what's been taken and what records, what would happen in that instance?
I think that you would have to do as much of the notification as you can. Like, it may take you some months to unravel and do some sort of root cause analysis or something like that and figure out what it was in your system that allowed the breach to occur. But you would at least say that these are the steps we're taking to investigate, for example. But I agree. You wouldn't necessarily know absolutely everything, and you wouldn't delay your notification until you knew everything, because otherwise it might take 8 months. And then you tell people that, oh, by the way, hey, back in February, that we had this incident, which is what the scheme is trying to avoid. I see one down the back.
There's also been a handful of questions around how does this affect, say, government departments and state government departments, and whether state privacy policy overrides the APP or not?
You know, I knew that was going to come up, and that's something which we're actually discussing internally at my firm, because we do HWL, it's a national firm, and we do a lot of work for government on the procurement side, as well as working for private sector IT companies. And it's a conversation that we're having internally under the Information Privacy Act of Queensland. It's quite possible that government departments, certain government departments may have to do this notification. So it's something which we're also looking at internally. It does have ramifications for government. Certain government agencies, I think, may be caught.
Hi there. I was wondering what the implications are for retrospectivity, in the sense that if you have a data breach on one date and it's not discovered past the 30 days or even longer, way past that, what the implications are on a company in those circumstances.
So first of all, the breach itself has happened after 22nd of Feb, and then it's taken you longer than 30 days so you've just delayed. Again, the guidelines say that if you can't do that notification within the 30 days, and mind you, the detail in the notifications is not that onerous. It's fairly general in nature. But if you can't comply with that 30 days, then you would have to document it, your reasons why, and reasons for the delay, and things like that, and then notify when you can. But of course, you would also have to explain to the Commissioner why it took you as long as it did. Again, I think the overriding principle is don't do nothing. Like, don't sit on it, don't delay, don't do nothing. Just, you do have to take reasonable steps. Yeah.
Is an IP address personal data under the Australian law? Is it opinions from technologists? I want to see what a lawyer says.
Yeah, there's not a clear case. There was one case in tribunal in New South Wales that I know of, which said yes, it's possible. Again, personal information, it depends on whether or not an individual's identity is reasonably ascertainable from the data. So I think it's arguable. IP addresses, there may be many people at a particular IP address. It doesn't pin down an individual, but I do know of a tribunal determination in New South Wales that said maybe, possibly, but it may depend on the circumstances. It depends, because again, there's another case which talks about data which was about a person, the identity of that person wasn't immediately ascertainable from the data alone. But if you matched it up with this database, and maybe the white pages, and you aggregated enough data, you'd figure out who it was. In those circumstances, that data was, I think, held not to be personal information, because yes, maybe it was ascertainable if you took enough steps, but that's not reasonably ascertainable from the data. So again, I think there's a subjective element to it, and it'll have to depend on circumstances. Well, if there were any other questions on this stage of it, we can... Sorry? 3 minutes. We can run through GDPR. Is everyone still awake? Awake? Good. We're going to run through it really quickly, the key points of GDPR. Now, GDPR started on the 25th of May, which is why it's so topical. It talks about data subjects in the EU. It affects Australian entities, particularly if they are selling to the EU, if they've got headquarters in the EU or some sort of office in the EU, or in some cases if they're tracking or processing data of EU subjects. They both deal with personal information. They're similar sort of concepts under both. One of the key differences is that GDPR doesn't have that $3 million threshold, so all entities are caught, no matter of what size. That means that a lot of Australian entities may be caught by GDPR, but not the Australian privacy legislation, which is really weird. The consent required under GDPR is a lot more stringent, where Australia, we get away with kind of like some sort of vague implied consent, and then you consent to a wider range of things than you probably thought that you were really consenting to, particularly if you're a Centrelink customer, apparently. Under the GDPR, the consent has to be a lot more specific, which is why you're seeing so many, hi, we've renewed our consents. Do you consent to this, this, and this? That's why, because their consent regime is a lot tougher than Australia's. Mandatory data breach, they also have it. Ours was modelled after theirs, so they are similar-ish, except that they require reporting within 72 hours, which makes our 30 days look a bit lame. The overseas transfers in Australia, you can do overseas transfers of personal information with some provisos. GDPR is a lot stricter. So there's another thing where we see compliance with GDPR hitting Australian entities. GDPR says that you can do overseas transfers to countries with an adequate level of data protection, but GDPR has done the additional step of listing which countries they accept. Australia is not on the list. Neither is USA. The penalties are also another key difference, where GDPR, as we were saying, the Privacy Act has theoretical $2.1 million maximum penalty, but in actual fact imposes far, far less, sometimes for even nominal amounts. GDPR, again, their technical maximum is up to 20 million euros, or 4% of annual worldwide turnover, which is why everybody's taking it very, very, very seriously. And also, GDPR introduces a pile of individual rights. Under the Australian Privacy Act, it's a privacy scheme, but it doesn't mean that individuals have a lot of individual rights. GDPR introduces them, things like the right to be forgotten. And that's probably all we have time to cover.
If everybody could thank Kay for this interesting presentation.
Thank you.